Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Beppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guests today are David Alexander Craig and Anna Sloan, co-directors of the Human Animal Research Interest Group at the University of Oregon. Craig is a PhD candidate in philosophy. His research examines the human-animal relation as manifested in the history of philosophy, with a specific focus on the thinking of Immanuel Kant. Sloan is a graduate student in anthropology. Her research focuses on the prehistoric archaeology of the northwest coast of North America and includes human environmental dynamics during the Holocene, zoo archaeology, gendered approaches to archaeology, and indigenous justice movements. Craig and Sloan organized a symposium on animal vulnerability at the U of O on June 6 and 7, 2014, in conjunction with the Oregon Humanities Center 2013-2014 theme, Vulnerable. Thank you both for coming on the show.
Thank you, Paul.
David, we'll start with you. Tell us about your scholarly background and how you came upon this dissertation project.
Yeah, so I have a bachelor's in philosophy and a master's in philosophy prior to coming to the University of Oregon. And philosophy is one of those expansive subjects that you can study so many topics and figures within it. It's often hard for a graduate student to find kind of their niche or where they can find purchase. I've always been interested in animals, pets, and relations to the natural world. But only since coming here and starting to work with my advisor, Ted Toadvine, who's an environmental phenomenologist, did I get put onto the philosophical topic of animality per se. And what occurred to me with that topic was that there's so many figures and moments in the history of philosophy that haven't been examined according to this lens. So thinking about that history, this history of ideas and concepts in terms of the human-animal relation and what's manifested there, in terms of the concepts and constructs of the human and of humanity that are constructed there over and against animals and animality. It's kind of a new direction and a new face and a new way of approaching this history. And Immanuel Kant, late 18th century German philosopher, kind of one of the main philosophers, kind of seen as the arch-modern philosopher. His philosophy is a great example of this, in that scholars have gone over and over his text for many decades, but this is a new area that there's new work to be done. And the claim of my dissertation project is, in turning to him in this way, we can yield both insights for understanding Kant in new ways, but also understanding the post-Kantian legacy in philosophy, and also to give resources for, say, contemporary animal rights activists and folks interested in animals today, that we can actually turn to Kant, read him in this new way, and get these new resources. So that's the hope of the project.
Fascinating. Anna, what led to your interest in the archaeology of the Northwest?
Well, I guess my background as an undergraduate was in anthropology and archaeology specifically. When I began looking into graduate school and thinking about what I might be interested in studying at that level, I was very drawn to the northern regions of North America.
Are you from the Pacific Northwest?
I'm actually not. No, I'm from the East Coast. I'm from the Boston area. So it's far away from that. It's not about growing up in that region. But actually my upbringing in the East Coast was very coastal. As a kid, I spent a lot of summers at the beach and got really interested in how humans interact with marine environments. So when I was looking for graduate programs, I was thinking about doing sort of coastal archaeology and looking at cultures that have made their way on sort of the coast and in those environments. I was able to do a field school before coming to graduate school in northwestern Alaska, around the Kotzebue area, and just fell in love with Alaska. It's an amazing place, really, really extreme environment, and fascinating to study for that reason. So my research looks at how humans have interacted with environments, specifically animals and their environments, into the deep past.
So how did the Human Animal Research Interest Group get started? And feel free, either or both of you, to answer.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe we both remember the moment when it started. So we have both been and kind of remain activists within the Graduate Teaching Fellows Union here at the university. And I suppose it was in spring 2011, we were at a convention for that together, and we had just met each other and were discussing our research. We found out that we're both interested in this animal topic. We also then realized that there are a number of people on campus we could point to that are all working on this, but then it occurred to us there's really no space for these researchers to come together. And we knew about research interest groups and knew about the Oregon Humanities Center and that it supports them. And we said, who's going to do this but us? So I think at that point we said, let's, philosophy and anthropology, different disciplines, but we have a lot of common interests. If we can find this, we can find others. I don't know if you have anything to add to that,
Yeah, I know. That's the story that I remember as well. And I just remember it at that time feeling very inspired about this idea of sort of bringing different departments on campus together to have a discussion. Because it's true that animal studies is something that really touches on any number of disciplines in a number of different ways, but there's not a lot of communication between these sort of different modes of thought on animals. So David and I were really excited to have the opportunity to start something like that at the university.
That's really the ideal of the RIG, to bring people from disparate fields together to talk about a shared interest. So who are some of the participants in the RIG? I mean, okay, so philosopher, anthropologist, who are some of these other people?
Yeah, well, I think we were pleased to find that as soon as we kind of put some feelers out there and sent some emails around, we got kind of a flood of responses, both from grads but also from faculty. So some of our most consistent faculty participants have been Deborah Mareskin in the School of Journalism and Communication. Her kind of research over the last decade or so is focused on animals in media. Carla Benston from the art department, who works on kind of animal art and the question of whether animals can create art and things like this. Your advisors in anthropology and if you have others to add in sociology.
Yeah.
So
we've had really a varied group, and it sort of ebbed and flowed sort of over the different terms. We've had a lot of different participants that have sort of come through the RIG. But yeah, I think sort of the variety of departments: English, sociology, environmental studies, art, as you mentioned, journalism and communication, and then of course anthropology and philosophy are home departments.
So how do you, all right, so everybody from these different fields, you get together monthly, something like that? What do you do?
Yeah, so our first year was an experimental year. Neither of us had certainly directed a RIG or didn't know exactly how it was going to take place. We knew we had a number of people interested. We started with an email listserv. That's at least one thing that we have and that we could start with right away. And so in the first year, we experimented with bi-weekly meetings, actually. So we'd have meetings either where we'd all read a text together and discuss it, or when a RIG member would present some of their work. And we've continued with that same structure this year as well, which this year has been a little bit less experimental. We've learned from our experiences from the year before. So I think we've met with a little less frequency, but tried to organize kind of larger events and meetings as well. So in addition to these regular kind of, we call them regular meetings, we've hosted a few invited speakers and hold these other events where there might be some focus of common interest to get people to come together. That has been the challenge, I'd say, is that everybody's interested in this topic from their own side. So the trick is to get topics out there that everybody's interested in.
So I'll ask you in a minute about the visitors that you've brought, but can you give me an example of a session where you were discussing a text or discussing the work of one of the participants that was particularly memorable? Can you just tell me one example from either year?
Gosh, there have been so many. I suppose, well, for me, actually, something that was very interesting was during our first year of the RIG, so last year, we sort of noticed a dearth of scientific texts in the RIG. We're a very sort of humanities and social sciences heavy group, but of course, sort of the hard sciences have a lot to contribute to discussions of animals as well. So for one particular session, we invited some of my colleagues in the anthropology department to talk a little bit about primate behavioral studies and a very vast and interesting field. And I believe we read some pieces that talked about maybe primate capabilities for language and emotion, right? So some of these things that have traditionally divided the human from the animal in one of our closest animal relatives. So this to me was a very interesting discussion because we did have sort of members of humanities and social sciences fields alongside with this sort of panel of biological anthropologists who really came at the discussion from a very scientific perspective. But what was so interesting about that conversation was just the dialogue that ensued, and you could sort of see people thinking of different perspectives than they had before, which is our ultimate goal.
Yeah, well, I think that is the ultimate goal. So I know last year the RIG hosted a talk by Virginia Morell. Who is Virginia Morell, and tell me about that talk.
Yeah, so Virginia Morell is one of these interesting figures today. I guess she's a science journalist, and she has an academic background as well. But in within kind of the realm of animal studies, so over the last 10 years or so, there's within the academy and beyond this new field of interest in animals and in animal research. And this has also come along with the popular interest in animals in a new way. I think not just within the academy, but beyond, people are interested to know more about what are people finding out and working on about animals, because there's a sense that the consensus is changing about what animals are and what the relation is. And Morell, in her most recent book, Animal Wise, which came out in 2013, so she visited the University of Oregon. We invited her as part of this book tour. In that, she catalogs kind of a list of 12 different meetings and conversations she's had with scientists and social science researchers on this topic. She's one of those people who kind of knows everybody. She's met everybody. She has really incredible stories to tell, and she can put on a wonderful presentation that reviews all the different work on these different types of animals being done and the conclusions there. So we brought her. She sold a number of copies of her books. I'd say that was probably our most well-attended event that we've had to date. We kind of filled one of the larger auditoriums on campus. And she was a really interesting person.
So you just hosted last weekend the Symposium on Animal Vulnerability. Tell us a little bit about the focus of the symposium. Animal vulnerability, what did you mean by that?
Well, we were excited, particularly being part of the Oregon Humanities Center, about the vulnerability theme for this year. And I think David and I both recognized sort of immediately a connection there, and maybe a void that we could fill with some animal studies work. The idea of animal vulnerability is just that animals of various kinds and to various degrees are in vulnerable situations. A lot of these relate to humans, and there are also a lot of crossovers between human vulnerabilities and animal vulnerabilities. We were interested in exploring these connections with our symposium.
So tell me who the keynote speaker was.
Yeah, for this event, we were able to bring in an invited keynote speaker. Her name is Hope Ferdowsian. She's a medical doctor and also an academic medical ethics researcher. She's at George Washington Medical Center and at Georgetown University in D.C. And her work is really fascinating because she's within the medical field has worked on advocating for underrepresented human groups, so homeless populations, victims of sexual assault and war crimes and migrants, but then also animals, whether scientific test subjects, animals who are caught in these similar types of vulnerable situations. And so she's a young researcher, but her work is really catching on, and she had a lot definitely to say about this connection. And also really something interesting that characterizes her work is its kind of international or global context. So she does a lot of traveling with these kind of NGOs and aid organizations, and in each of these cases she was able to demonstrate how she sees parallels between these human vulnerabilities and these animal vulnerabilities. And in her presentation she really made the case that we need to think, her presentation was called Common Needs, Common Ground, that we need to think the common needs and vulnerabilities of humans and non-human animals, but also the common ground in treating them. So problem she identified as often we see it as a zero-sum game. Either you attend to humans or you attend to non-human animals, and if that's the case, usually humans will win out. Well, she insists that it's not a zero-sum game. There's enough resources that we can attend to both, and that we're better off if we do so.
So that was Friday night, and on Saturday, tell us what was going on at the symposium on Saturday.
Well, on Saturday, we hosted a day of presentations focusing on the animal studies community at the university. So we had faculty presentations and also those from graduate students, 6 presentations in total. And they were fantastic. We had representations from the Department of Journalism and Communications. Deb Merskin gave a great talk on sort of representations of animals in the media and how animal shaming relates to their suffering. We had Rachel Rochester, a graduate student in the English department, talk about some literary connections between honeybees and migrant labor. We had Alan Reynolds, a philosophy graduate student, talk about sort of this human-animal question in regards to contractarianism in philosophy.
Can I just ask you what contractarianism is?
Yeah, so in philosophy we identify contractarianism as the kind of tradition from Hobbes and Locke and some of the early social contract theorists through the John Rawls and other philosophers today, and just this idea that we can understand an ideal society on the model of a social contract that we kind of begin in a certain state of nature, then society is formed in a contractual relationship. And Alan is trying to point out that the failures of that system to account for human-animal relation, in that animals can't really consent to a contract, and often in all these different cases, animals are kind of left out of the contract. So that's an interesting debate within philosophy.
Is that, want to tell me about anybody else, or is that good?
Oh,
yeah. Then there were three other
well,
presenters.
we had three other great presenters. I'll give you a quick just to give you sort of the scope.
Yeah.
We had an anthropology presenter who talked about primate vulnerability, and actually a population of primates, rhesus macaques, that are the most invulnerable. So sort of the contrast to vulnerable question.
Because they're the largest and most violent, or something like that?
They're extremely adaptable. Rhesus macaques have essentially colonized many areas of the world very successfully. It's really hard to eradicate them. On the opposite side of that, though, they're also used most commonly as test subjects for medical testing for that reason, exactly. So it's a mixed sort of invulnerability, vulnerability question with them. And we had other presentations from the sociology department about invasive species. And then we capped off the day with a presentation by architecture faculty member Brooke Mueller, who presented on ecological design in cities and how we can incorporate new species into designing cities. Yeah.
So success?
I'd say so. Our group is still growing, and so I think we're definitely still reaching out, trying to get more people in. But one of the great advantages of this event, and I think what made it a great success, is that we could really capitalize on the interdisciplinary nature of the subject. I mean, all 7 of our presentations, included in our keynote, each came from different disciplines and different approaches. And so people were able to turn out at especially the Saturday portion of the symposium for these different talks, and there was a really, I'd say, like a cross-pollination, to speak to Rachel Rochester's theme of bees, between the topics. So, not only, and the symposium was a success as well because we could appeal to these departments for support and say, this is the topic that researchers in your field are working on. And I think this event showcased, perhaps better than any other we've done, the interdisciplinary kind of multi-angled nature of this question, and in that sense, I think it did exactly what we wanted it to do.
So you say that the rig is still growing. What are your plans for the future of the rig?
Well, we hope to continue the rig into the years to come. I think the symposium has been a wonderful sort of centralizing event, and it's given us a web presence, which we didn't have before, something that we're hoping to continue. David, I know, is interested in starting a blog for the rig. Perhaps an online space where we can talk about our presentations and also link to relevant articles and scholarship and events that are happening. I think we're hoping to sort of continue with the format that we've used over the past years, but maybe even expanding into new kinds of media. One of the things that we've been doing this year is hosting film screenings as well at the end of every term, sort of a way to bring people together for a different kind of stimulation. So things of that nature, I think, will be in our future for sure.
That's great. Each of you, how has your involvement with the human-animal rig informed your research? Has it?
Yes, well, I suppose I could start off with that one. I think it's benefited my research tremendously. So in philosophy, as in so many other fields, there's pressure to specialize, and by definition, especially with a dissertation topic, it's kind of narrowly ensconced within the field. One of the benefits of working on the animal topic is that it kind of inevitably spills out beyond the discipline. And again, we were speaking about animal studies, this kind of growing interdisciplinary movement. Working with the human-animal rig at the University of Oregon in particular, and kind of getting this off the ground, gives me a lot of hope and promise for the future of, say, my own research. I now know that I want to work in an interdisciplinary context. And also I think there's kind of benefit for the profession with regards to that. Schools like NYU and UCLA have animal studies programs. These are some of the first of the nation. University of Oregon doesn't yet, but perhaps in the future it will. And so I think this type of model of a topic or thematic-based group that can bring different disciplines together and really do interesting and innovative work is, I think, something we're going to see more of in the future. And I'm pleased that we were able to be on the ground floor of it here at the university.
So Anna, how about you? Has it helped you in your research?
Oh, it definitely has. I think my involvement in the rig has been really instrumental to some of the directions that I'm taking my research. I'm still sort of a young graduate student. I completed my master's this past year.
Early.
Early, yeah. Early versus young. early graduate student, so I'm still formulating my doctoral research. But just sort of seeing the connections, as you said, David, the interdisciplinary connections has provided me with new questions with which I can sort of interrogate the archaeological record, particularly discussions that we've had in the RIG. I'm very interested in gender and sort of how gender relates to human-animal relations. And a number of the scholars that we've spoken with and presented with at the RIG have sort of similar ideas about this, so just sort of bouncing ideas off of other people has really expanded the way that I think about what is possible in archaeology and zooarchaeology, which tends to be a very, has tended to be a very scientifically narrow discipline.
Can I ask you a follow-up on the gender
Sure,
question?
yeah.
Gender in relation to the humans, gender in relation to the animals, gender in relation to both.
Yeah, so I guess I can maybe address that by specific examples from the region in which I work, which is sort of northern Alaska. And I look into Inupiat and Yupik communities, which is sort of in this area, and their ancestors with the archaeological remains. One of the really striking things about these cultures is that you can't talk about gender without talking about animals, and vice versa. Hunting is very ingrained in gender philosophy and gender relations in these societies, and that is a generalization, but sort of for the sake of time, I'll say that. For instance, we typically think of hunting in the far north as something done by men, sort of male hunters going out and being really tough and getting large sea mammals and other things. But what I'm learning about in my research is how women are also complicit in hunting. Oftentimes it's women's spiritual agency that they believe makes the men successful in hunting. So for my own research, I'm sort of looking at these connections and thinking about how we can see them in the past. And I think that, you know, that example aside, there are other connections that are a lot broader than that, that are cross-cultural. When we talk about, you know, vulnerability, it's difficult to talk about one type of vulnerability without talking about others, and there are certainly parallels, I think some of which maybe Deb has pointed out in some of her work, between gender vulnerabilities and the way that we think about animals as well.
So David, congratulations for being awarded a 2014-15 UO Doctoral Research Fellowship. How will the award help you?
Yeah, well, I guess, you know, it frees me from teaching responsibility and such and such. I love teaching, but this award will give me geographic flexibility and just the resources to really develop my project in the fullest extent. So I definitely plan to complete my dissertation next year on
Geographic flexibility, what do you mean by that?
Yes, well actually, my partner who's in comparative literature will be at Johns Hopkins University next year. And so I may be able to, say, go travel with her. I'll be able to attend all the conferences I need to. And I'll be on the academic job market next year. So it'll, you know, and I'm a night owl, so it really allows me to kind of set up an idiosyncratic schedule for working and such. So I think it's going to do everything I need. So.
Anna, congratulations to you for winning the Cressman Prize for your recent paper. Tell me, first of all, what's the Cressman Prize?
Well, the Cressman Prize is named for Luther Cressman, who was one of the sort of early archaeological pioneers at U of O, a very prominent figure. And the prize is awarded to a student paper of good quality in our department.
So tell us about that paper.
So this is a paper that came out of my master's research, which I recently completed, and it explores some of the links that I've already been talking about, specifically between birds, women, and spirituality in pre-contact or prehistoric Alaskan societies. So for this project, I examined a bunch of bird bones under a microscope, looking for any cut marks. Bird bones, yes. Okay. So these are remains that were recovered from an archaeological site, a couple thousand years old. And I looked for cut marks on the bones that might indicate how people had used them. The cut marks that I found indicated to me that people might have been making needles out of those bird bones, and also might have been skinning birds in order to make bird skin parkas, which are documented ethnographically for this group. And typically in contemporary societies, it's women that are involved in these processes. So I was sort of exploring these links with that paper that I got the prize for.
What kind of birds?
Well, so seabirds mostly.
So fairly sizable.
Fairly sizable. Well, the size really depends. So there were significant numbers of murres at this site, which are pretty small birds. You know, they're sort of little black cliff-dwelling birds. There were also sizable amounts of ducks, geese, and ptarmigan, which are more land-type birds. But yeah, an interesting diversity of fauna.
So David, I want to ask you a question about Kant and animals. So I'm just an English professor, so I don't know a lot about Kant, but what I know about Kant does not make me think that there's much interest in Kantian animal agency, identity at all. Why am I wrong?
Yeah, so, and that's the received view that we have. So Kant is kind of a bad guy of animal philosophy in a sense, and of, you know, animal rights activists often point to Kant says that animals, because they don't have reason or rationality, aren't deserving of full moral consideration. And Kant does say this, but I believe if you kind of take a wider reading of Kant's text, in particular his theory of human nature, there's something much more interesting and kind of subtle going on there, which is that for Kant, even though he says, you know, humans and rational agents are full moral agents and non-human animals are not, within the human being, our own animality contributes to our, say, moral flourishing, our personal flourishing, and to our humanity. So he, on the one hand, separates the human from the animal, but on the other hand, within human nature and these other aspects, shows and kind of, he can't escape the fact that animality contributes to who we are. So I'm interested to recover that aspect of his work and show, you know, the legacy of that as well, because I think that's another component of this question today.
It's not an overcoming of the animal by reason that he advocates for?
You would think, and that's what I thought at first as well. And a lot of people read it that way, but it's more a channeling or directing of animality. You can't renounce it. He says, if you were to get rid of your animality, you would no longer be human. So for Kant, human animality is much more central than, you know, I think scholars of Kant have understood.
Well, I want to thank you both for taking the time to speak with us today about the human-animal rig, about your respective work, about the symposium that you organized. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Paul.
You're welcome. I've been speaking with graduate students David Alexander Craig and Anna Sloan, co-directors of the Human-Animal Research Interest Group at the University of Oregon. Thanks so much for watching.